The house smelled wrong. It wasn't the usual scent of lemon cleaner or the vanilla candle Rochelle Graves liked to burn in the evenings. It was something thicker, heavier, something that made the air feel tainted. 17-year-old Lenora Graves stood at the kitchen sink, her breath ragged, her fingers numb as they fumbled under the stream of cold water. The tap ran at full blast, but no matter how much she scrubbed, the red stains clung to the creases of her skin. Dark, sticky, permanent. The knife lay on the counter, still dripping. A few inches away, the hammer rested where she had dropped it. The wooden handle was slick with blood, a stark contrast against the white-tiled floor. And beyond it, her mother's body. Rochelle wasn't moving. She wasn't gasping, crying, screaming. She was just still. Lenora had never seen her mother so quiet before. The pool of blood surrounding Rochelle's head had started to spread, creeping toward the edge of the cabinets. The thick red liquid seeped into the grout lines between the tiles, staining them in a way that Lenora knew would never fully come out. Even bleach wouldn't erase this. She took a shaky breath and squeezed her eyes shut. Breathe. Think. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She had planned to talk to her mother. Reason with her. Maybe even threaten to leave. But the moment Rochelle grabbed her phone and made that threat, to destroy Jasper's life, something inside Lenora snapped. It had happened so fast. Too fast. She had grabbed the hammer without thinking. The first swing landed with a sickening crack. Her mother stumbled, her eyes wide, her mouth opening in shock. Not pain, just pure, raw disbelief. The second swing made her fall. The third left her gasping, her hands twitching, fingers trying to crawl toward something. Maybe for help, maybe for Lenora. But Lenora couldn't stop. She didn't stop until Rochelle stopped moving. Then she saw the blood. So much of it. Her hands still trembled as she turned off the faucet. She gripped the edges of the sink, her knuckles white. It's okay. You just need to think. Her brain was moving too fast and too slow at the same time. How do you clean this up? How do you fix this? The house was too quiet. The only sounds were the faint humming of the refrigerator and the distant chirp of crickets outside. She turned toward the body again, forcing herself to look. It didn't even look like her mother anymore. Her mother had always been strong. Not just physically but in everything she did. Rochelle Graves had been a woman who demanded respect. The kind of mother who expected perfection and got it. Now she was nothing but a lifeless heap on the cold kitchen floor. Lenora took a step forward, her shoes making a faint squelch in the blood. She flinched. Oh God. Her stomach twisted, and for a brief, horrible second, she thought she might throw up right there next to her mother's body. No, she couldn't fall apart now. Jasper would be home soon. He couldn't see this. He would hate her. Lenora clenched her jaw, forcing the nausea down. She had to make this look right. A break-in. That was the only way. She had watched enough true crime shows to know what to do. She reached for the knife, her bloody fingers wrapping around the handle. And then she stabbed. The first stab was messy. The second was easier. By the time she stopped, 18 wounds marked Rochelle's body. It had to look real. Real enough to fool the police. Lenora took another breath. Now all she had to do was lie. Lenora Graves had always been the good girl. The kind of daughter that made other mothers jealous. Polite, quiet, well-mannered. Straight-A student. The kind of girl who never talked back, never stayed out late, never broke a rule. At least that's what everyone thought. Her mother, Rochelle Graves, made sure of it. Rochelle wasn't just strict, she was unyielding. Her expectations weren't suggestions, they were law. And Lenora had learned early on that disobedience came with consequences. You do as I say because I know what's best for you, Rochelle would say. And Lenora would nod because that was what was expected. She had no choice. Growing up, their home felt more like a school than a place of comfort. Schedules were strict. Homework had to be done at the kitchen table under her mother's watchful eye. No TV until all assignments were double-checked. No sleepovers. No junk food. No dating. It wasn't that Rochelle didn't love her daughter. She did. But her love came with rules. No distractions. No boys. No failure. The biggest rule of all? Lenora would go to the University of Florida and become a doctor. That had been decided since the day she was born. Rochelle had sacrificed too much for anything less. She had worked endless shifts as a nurse, saving every penny, setting aside every spare moment for Lenora's future. She didn't do it out of cruelty, she did it because she thought she was building something better for her only child. And for a long time Lenora played along. She studied. She obeyed. She pretended. But deep inside she felt like a bird with clipped wings. At 17, Lenora was still the same quiet, perfect daughter in her mother's eyes. But she was also someone else. Someone her mother didn't know. Lenora had learned how to lie. How to hide things just beneath the surface. How to smile and nod while secretly carving out pieces of herself that her mother would never accept. And then she met Jasper Kane. Jasper was the kind of boy her mother would have hated. He was 19 with messy brown hair and a reckless smile, the kind of boy who didn't follow rules because he didn't care about them. His hands were always a little dirty from working on his old car, his jeans torn at the knees. He didn't talk about grades or college applications. He talked about freedom, adventure, escape. Lenora had never wanted anything before. Not like this. He made her feel alive. For the first time in her life, she wasn't just following orders. She was choosing. It started with small lies. She told her mother she was at a study group when she was really sneaking out with Jasper, curled up next to him in his rusted-out truck, watching the stars. She said she was staying after school for extra credit when she was really lying on his couch, listening to old records, feeling weightless for the first time. With Jasper she could breathe. But Lenora knew it wouldn't last. Her mother was too smart. Too controlling. Eventually she would find out. So Lenora made a choice. A big one. She wasn't going to wait until after college. She wasn't going to let her mother decide her future. She and Jasper were going to get married. The idea started as a joke. They were sitting on the beach, their feet buried in the cool night sand, the waves crashing softly in the distance. What if we just ran away? Jasper had said, staring up at the sky. Lenora had laughed, but the idea burrowed into her mind. Run away. Be free. Make her own choices. Marry me, Jasper had said one night, half serious, half teasing. And then, just like that, it wasn't a joke anymore. A week later they did it. It wasn't a big wedding. No guests, no dress, no flowers. Just a courthouse, some paperwork, and the two of them standing side by side. Jasper slipped a thin silver band onto her finger. Lenora Kane. For the first time she felt like she belonged to herself. She wasn't Rochelle Graves' perfect daughter anymore. She was Lenora Kane. And she never wanted to go back. For 2 weeks, Lenora lived a double life. At home she was still the same obedient daughter. She studied at the kitchen table, ate dinner with her mother, followed curfew. But in secret, she was married. At night, she would press her fingers against her ring, tucked away in her pocket during the day. She and Jasper would whisper about their future, about the apartment they would get, about all the places they would go. But Lenora forgot one thing. Secrets never stay buried. Her mother found out the truth, not because of Jasper, not because of a slip-up, but because of a letter. A small, innocent letter that changed everything. One afternoon, Rochelle picked up the mail, flipping through bills and store coupons. But then she saw it. A withdrawal confirmation from the University of Florida. Lenora had dropped out. Rochelle's fingers tightened around the paper. And that's when she knew, her daughter had betrayed her. Lenora Graves had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Lenora Graves thought she had more time. She had planned to ease her mother into the truth, first by talking about how college wasn't the right choice for her, then maybe months later admitting she was married. But life doesn't wait for perfect timing. The discovery happened by accident. A simple letter. A few lines of printed text. And suddenly the world Lenora had carefully built came crashing down. The afternoon was quiet, just like any other. The Florida sun was bright, spilling through the large front window, painting golden streaks across the tile floor. Rochelle stood by the kitchen counter, flipping through the stack of mail. Her shift at the hospital had been long, and she was looking forward to a hot bath and a book before dinner. Bill. Coupon flyer. Another bill. Then an official letter from the University of Florida. She frowned and tore it open. Her eyes skimmed the first few lines. Then she read them again. Slower this time. We have processed your withdrawal request and confirmed that your enrollment at the University of Florida has been officially terminated as of last week. Rochelle's heart stopped. Her fingers gripped the paper so tightly it wrinkled in her hands. Withdrawal? Terminated enrollment? She blinked, trying to make sense of it. This had to be a mistake. Lenora wouldn't do this. She couldn't. Rochelle inhaled sharply, her body stiff as she called out. Lenora Elaine Graves. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the house like a knife. Upstairs, Lenora's stomach dropped. She had just gotten home from seeing Jasper. She hadn't even changed out of her jeans and tank top. But the tone in her mother's voice told her everything. She knew. Lenora's legs felt like stone as she made her way downstairs. She barely had time to speak before Rochelle shoved the paper in her face. What is this? Her mother demanded, voice dangerously low. Tell me right now. Lenora's throat went dry. She stared at the words, her own lies staring back at her. I was going to tell you, she whispered. Rochelle took a step closer, her nostrils flaring. Tell me what? Lenora hesitated for half a second too long. Rochelle's sharp gaze flickered downward, to her left hand. And there, glinting under the kitchen light, was a thin silver band. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Rochelle ripped Lenora's hand up, holding it in front of her own face like she needed to see it up close to believe it. Her mother's breathing changed. Slow. Sure. Disbelieving. No, she whispered. You did not. Lenora tried to pull her hand back. Mom let me? You did not. Rochelle roared, shoving Lenora's hand away like it burned her. The letter crumpled in Rochelle's fist as she took a step back, her face twisting. Her perfect daughter, her straight-A college-bound, obedient daughter, had betrayed her. The words fell like stones from Rochelle's lips. You married that boy? Lenora swallowed. Mom, please. Just let me explain. You threw your life away for some boy? Rochelle spat, her voice rising. Lenora flinched at the word. Some boy. Jasper wasn't just some boy. He was her husband. He was the first person who made her feel free. I love him, Lenora shot back, her voice stronger now. He loves me. And I don't want to be a doctor. I never did. Rochelle's hand slammed against the counter, rattling the silverware. Don't you dare say that to me, she seethed, her chest rising and falling with every deep breath. I raised you. I worked double shifts to give you a future, and you're telling me you're throwing it all away? Lenora stepped back, her own anger rising now. No, Mom. You decided my future. You never let me choose. I don't want to live the life you planned for me. Rochelle laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You don't even know what life is, she snapped. You think you're in love? You think this boy, this Jasper, is going to take care of you? He's nothing, Lenora. He's just another low-life dropout who'll leave you the second things get hard. Lenora's hands clenched into fists. That's not true, she hissed. Rochelle's eyes burned as she took another step forward. You are my daughter, she said, her voice cold. And you will do as I say. Lenora shook her head. I'm married now. You can't control me anymore. For the first time, Rochelle looked truly disgusted. Then she exhaled, slow and deliberate, like she had made a decision. And then she said the words that sealed her fate. You will get this marriage annulled. Or so help me, I will ruin that boy's life. Lenora's breath caught. Her mother's voice wasn't just angry anymore. It was something worse. Deadly. Rochelle was serious. She would make calls. File reports. Get Jasper fired. Maybe even make it sound like he forced her into it. Lenora knew her mother was capable of it. She had spent her entire life watching Rochelle win every battle. At work. With neighbors. With family members. She didn't just get angry. She got even. And now, she was coming for Jasper. Lenora's vision blurred with panic. Her mother had already ripped away 17 years of her life. She couldn't let her take Jasper too. Her heart pounded against her ribs. Her fingers twitched. The air between them was thick, heavy with something dangerous. Rochelle turned toward the counter, reaching for her phone. Don't, Lenora whispered. Her mother ignored her, scrolling through contacts. I'll call his parents first, she muttered. Then the school board. If you think for 1 second. Lenora lunged. Her fingers wrapped around the hammer lying on the counter. She barely even thought about it. The only thought in her head was make her stop. The first blow landed with a crack. Rochelle gasped, her phone slipping from her hands. She stumbled, her knees buckling. Blood dripping from her temple. Her mother turned to face her, eyes wide with confusion. Lenora swung again. This time Rochelle fell. And for the first time in Lenora's life, her mother stopped talking. The room felt small. The walls of the kitchen closed in, shrinking as the sound of Rochelle's voice filled every inch of the air. The phone was still in her hand, her thumb hovering over the screen, ready to ruin everything. Lenora's world was seconds away from collapsing. Her mother was about to destroy Jasper. Her mother was about to erase the only happiness she had ever known. Lenora couldn't let that happen. Not again. She saw the hammer lying on the counter. Her mother's hammer. The same one Rochelle had used just that morning to fix a loose nail in one of the kitchen chairs. Her fingers twitched. Something inside her mind snapped, like a rubber band stretched too tight for too long. Her body moved before she even realized it. She lunged. The hammer was heavier than she expected. It wasn't like in the movies where things were fast and clean. It was real. It was messy. The moment the metal struck her mother's head, Lenora felt the impact shake through her entire arm. A sickening crack filled the air. Rochelle gasped, a sharp, choked sound, and stumbled forward. For a split second, Lenora froze. She expected it to be over. She thought one hit would be enough. But Rochelle didn't fall. She let out a low, broken noise somewhere between a gasp and a groan. Her knees buckled and she reached blindly for the counter. She was still alive, still moving, still fighting. Her mother's eyes were wide with shock, disbelief and something else, betrayal. Lenora? Lenora's breath came in sharp, ragged bursts. She had two choices. Let her mother get up. Let her call the police. Let her take everything away. Or finish it. Her grip tightened around the hammer. And she swung again. This time Rochelle fell. Her body hit the floor with a heavy thud, her arms twitching, fingers clawing at the tile. Lenora watched, wide-eyed, waiting for her mother to stop moving. But she didn't. She was still alive. Still breathing. Still fighting. Blood spilled from the wound on her head, a deep, dark red that pooled against the floor. It smelled sharp. Metallic. The scent of something final. But Rochelle's hand twitched. Her fingers dragged weakly across the tile, reaching for something. Lenora took a step back. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen at all. A fresh wave of panic slammed into her. She had to make sure. She had to end this. Her eyes darted around the room. That's when she saw it, the knife lying next to the sink. Lenora barely remembered grabbing it. 1 second she was staring at her mother's body on the floor. The next she was kneeling beside it, the knife in her hands. Her mother's breath was shallow. Lenora could hear it, weak, uneven. Her mother was dying but not fast enough. She couldn't leave it like this. She had to make sure. She had to be certain. So she stabbed. The first stab was messy. Her hands were shaking. The blade didn't go in the way she expected. The second was easier. By the third she wasn't thinking anymore. She kept going until the only sound in the house was the slow, steady drip of blood hitting the tile. By the time she stopped there were 18 stab wounds. She let out a shaky breath, her arms aching, her hands sticky with blood. The world felt too quiet. It was over. Her mother was gone. Lenora staggered backward, dropping the knife onto the floor with a dull clatter. Her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The kitchen looked different now. The bright Florida sunlight still streamed through the windows, still cast warm patches of light onto the floor. But everything felt wrong. The warmth in the room didn't belong. The world outside kept going, but inside this house, everything had stopped. Lenora's body felt numb. Her mind tried to tell her this wasn't real. That her mother was going to stand up any second now, yell at her, ground her, take her phone away. But Rochelle wasn't getting up. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't anything anymore. Lenora's arms hung limply at her sides. This was it. This was the moment she had been waiting for, right? She was free now. So why did it feel like she couldn't breathe? A loud ringing filled her ears. Or maybe it was silence. She couldn't tell. The whole world felt like it had shifted, like the air itself was different now. She blinked down at her hands, at the sticky red stains covering her fingers, her wrists, the fabric of her jeans. She needed to wash it off. She needed to think. Her body moved on its own, dragging her toward the sink. She turned on the faucet and scrubbed. The water ran pink. She scrubbed harder. Pink turned to red. She scrubbed until her skin burned. But no matter how much she scrubbed, it felt like the blood was still there. She gritted her teeth, pressing her hands harder against the roughness of the sponge. Her mother was gone. No more rules. No more control. No more being told what to do. So why did it feel like she had lost? Lenora wiped her hands on a dish towel, her movements stiff, robotic. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She had to think. Jasper would be home soon. He couldn't see this. He couldn't know. She had done this for him. She had done this so they could be together. So they could be free. But if he saw this, if he saw her like this, he might leave. Lenora swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe. She had to fix this. She had to clean up. She had to make it look like something else. Something that wasn't her. Something that wasn't murder. Her eyes flicked to the front door. If someone broke in, if it was a robbery, she could make it work. Her mother's blood was still warm, but the clock was ticking. Lenora took one last look at the body. And then she started to stage the crime scene. The silence was unbearable. Lenora's breath came in quick, shallow gasps as she forced herself to stare at the body on the floor. Her mother's body. It didn't feel real. The blood, so much blood, had begun to spread, darkening as it thickened on the tile. The scent of it clung to the air, heavy, metallic, suffocating. Lenora swallowed back the bile rising in her throat. No time for this. She had to move. She had to fix this. She wiped her shaking hands on her jeans, smearing red streaks across the denim. Her mother's words still echoed in her head. Annul the marriage. Destroy Jasper's life. Lenora had stopped that from happening. But at what cost? Her fingers curled into fists, nails biting into her skin. She couldn't let this be for nothing. Jasper could never know. If he saw this, if he knew what she had done, he might leave her. And she had done this for them. She had to make it look like something else. Something not her. Something that would keep Jasper from looking at her with fear in his eyes. She had to make it look like a robbery. Lenora forced her legs to move, even as they trembled beneath her. She grabbed the first thing she could reach, a lamp from the side table, and hurled it to the ground. The crash shattered the quiet, glass flying across the floor. She reached for the drawers next, yanking them open, spilling papers, silverware, whatever she could find onto the floor. Her hands moved fast, but her mind was racing faster. Think, Lenora. Think. She needed to make it believable. She sprinted to the living room, grabbing the cushions from the couch, throwing them across the room. The coffee table was too neat. She knocked it over, sending magazines and an old mug crashing to the floor. She darted back to the kitchen, panting now. The room still didn't look right. It looked like a mess but not a crime scene. Her mother had been stabbed 18 times. A robbery didn't make sense. Robbers don't stab people that many times. The thought sent a cold shiver down her spine. She grabbed a rag and started smearing blood near the entrance, on the walls, near the door, anything to make it look like an intruder had been there. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best she could do. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She was running out of time. Jasper would be home soon. Lenora's hands were still sticky with blood when she turned to the sink. The water roared as she scrubbed, her skin turning raw under the pressure. The sink turned pink, then red, then clear. She grabbed the dish towel, dried her hands, then froze. Her clothes. Her jeans were soaked, dark patches of blood staining the thighs, the knees. Her shirt, her favorite white tank top, was ruined. She ran to the laundry room, ripped off the jeans, peeled off the stained tank top. Her breath was shaky as she stuffed them into the washer, slamming the door shut. She set it to the fastest cycle, her fingers fumbling over the buttons. The washer whirred to life. Lenora exhaled, her pulse still racing. She was almost done. She was going to get away with this. She just had to make the call. Lenora grabbed the phone from the counter. Her thumb hovered over the numbers. Could she do this? Could she lie? Her stomach churned. She had to. She had no choice. With a deep breath, she dialed. The phone rang once. Twice. A click. 911, what's your emergency? Lenora let out a scream. She made it sound real, panicked, broken, desperate. She gasped, sobbing into the receiver. Help. Someone broke in. My mom, she's not moving. The operator's voice was calm, controlled. Okay, ma'am, I need you to stay on the line with me. Are you in a safe place? I think so, Lenora whimpered. I don't know. The front door was open when I got home and then I saw her. There's so much blood. She hiccuped, let out another sob. She was shaking for real now. She had killed her mother. And she had just called the police on herself. Ma'am, I need you to take a deep breath, the operator instructed. Help is on the way. Can you check if your mother is breathing? Lenora choked on air. She didn't have to check. She knew. But she played along, crawling toward the body, her hands hovering over the still warm skin of her mother's wrist. She pressed down gently. Nothing. She swallowed. She's cold. Pause. Okay, ma'am. Stay on the line. Officers will be there soon. Lenora nodded even though no one could see her. Okay. Her voice was barely a whisper. The call ended. And Lenora sat there, staring at her mother's lifeless body, waiting for the sirens to come. Waiting for the lie to begin. The sirens were loud, cutting through the humid Florida night. Flashes of red and blue painted the walls of the Graves house, flickering against the blood-streaked tile floor. Lenora sat on the couch, wrapped in a thin gray blanket, her legs pulled to her chest. She stared at her hands, clean now but still shaking. She had done everything right. She had staged the scene. She had made the call. She had cried when the first officers arrived, sobbed when they pulled her away from the kitchen. She had played the grieving daughter perfectly. But still, something felt off. The air was too still as the officers moved around the house, marking evidence, muttering to one another. She could feel their eyes on her. Watching. Studying. Lenora forced herself to look devastated. It wasn't hard. She had just killed her own mother. The moment Detective Raylan Moore stepped into the house, Lenora knew she was different from the other officers. Moore was tall, lean, dressed in plain slacks and a simple button-up. No nonsense. No wasted movement. Her gray-blue eyes flickered over every inch of the room before settling on Lenora. She didn't offer sympathy. She didn't say she was sorry for her loss. She just walked over and knelt in front of her. "Sweetheart," she said, voice gentle but firm. "Can you tell me what happened?" Lenora sniffled, her lips trembling as she clutched the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She had practiced this in her head. Every word. I got home and the front door was open," she whispered, voice cracking. "I called for my mom but she didn't answer. So I walked inside and I saw her." Moore didn't react. She just watched. Lenora swallowed hard. Her voice broke. "I think they took stuff. It was all a mess. Like they were looking for something." Moore tilted her head slightly. "What did they take?" Lenora hesitated for half a second too long. I don't know. Jewelry maybe? Some money?" Moore nodded slowly. "Okay." She didn't write anything down. For the next hour, officers moved through the house, snapping photos, collecting evidence. Lenora stayed on the couch, forcing herself to keep crying every now and then. But she could hear them whispering. "The blood spatter doesn't make sense for a struggle. There's no sign of forced entry. The stab wounds are excessive." A sharp, tight feeling curled in Lenora's chest. She focused on keeping her breathing even, on blinking at just the right moments to make her eyes look puffy and tired. But she knew what they were thinking. Robbers don't kill like this. Robbers don't stab someone 18 times. Robbers don't leave everything valuable behind. Her story wasn't perfect. They were already doubting her. "Detective?" Lenora's head snapped up at the sound of an officer's voice. She followed his gaze as he lifted a clear plastic evidence bag, and inside she saw it. Her clothes. The ones she had tossed in the washer. The blood-soaked jeans. The stained white tank top. Detective Moore stared at them for a long time. And that was the moment Lenora knew it was over. Moore turned back to Lenora, her expression unreadable. "Can you tell me what you were wearing when you got home?" Lenora's mouth went dry. She had practiced everything, except for this. Her pulse thundered in her ears. I changed?" Moore raised an eyebrow. "Why?" I got blood on me when I checked if she was alive." "Right?" Moore glanced at the washer again. "You must have been in shock. I imagine most people wouldn't think to do laundry after finding their mother dead." Lenora's stomach dropped. The air felt tighter. She felt like she was drowning in it. Moore stood, brushing off her pants. "We're going to need you to come down to the station." Lenora blinked. Moore's lips curved into something almost sympathetic. "We just have a few more questions." But Lenora knew what that meant. She was caught. The walls were closing in. And there was nowhere left to run. The police station was cold. Not the kind of cold that came from air conditioning, but the kind that settled in your bones, the kind that made you feel small, exposed, trapped. Lenora sat at the metal table in the interrogation room, staring at the one-way mirror, knowing there were eyes behind it, watching her, studying her. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap. She had to look calm. She had to stay in control. But her heart was slamming against her ribs. They knew. She could feel it in the way the officers looked at her, in the way they whispered in the hallways. Her story was falling apart. The door clicked open and Detective Raylan Moore stepped inside, holding a thin file in one hand and a styrofoam cup in the other. She placed the cup in front of Lenora. "Water?" Lenora shook her head. Her throat was too tight to drink anything. Moore didn't sit down right away. She stood across from her, flipping open the file, skimming the contents with an unreadable expression. Then she sighed and finally lowered herself into the chair. "You've had a long night," she said, almost like she felt bad for Lenora. Lenora nodded, keeping her face blank. I just want to go home." Moore tapped her nails against the table. "We want that too. We just need to clear up a few inconsistencies first." Lenora's stomach tightened. "What inconsistencies?" she asked, her voice light, controlled. Moore tilted her head. "You said the front door was open when you got home." Lenora nodded. "Yes. We checked the locks," Moore continued. "No forced entry. No sign of tampering." Lenora swallowed. "Maybe they picked the lock?" Moore hummed. "Maybe. But they didn't take anything?" Lenora froze. Moore's gaze sharpened. "No missing valuables. No drawers rifled through. Just a mess like someone wanted it to look like a robbery. You see the problem, don't you?" Lenora licked her lips, trying to ignore the growing pressure in her chest. She had planned for this. She just had to keep playing the part. "They must have gotten scared and ran," she said, trying to sound uncertain, like she was just a girl trying to make sense of something awful. Moore nodded slowly as if she was considering that. Then she flipped to the next page in the file. What about your clothes? She asked. Lenora's pulse jumped. What about them? Moore leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. You were wearing something else when the officers arrived? Lenora nodded. Yeah, I told you. I changed because I got blood on me. You also did laundry? The words hit like a hammer. Lenora felt the air shift. Moore wasn't asking a question. She was leading her somewhere. I panicked, Lenora said quickly. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't thinking. Moore watched her. The silence stretched too long. Then she leaned back and crossed her arms. You know, I've been doing this for a long time, she said casually. And in all the cases I've worked, I've never met someone who finds their mother dead on the floor and immediately thinks to do a load of laundry. Lenora's hands clenched into fists under the table. Her throat was dry. She had to stay calm. She had to keep lying. But then Moore pulled out the last piece of evidence. Moore slid a photo across the table. Lenora's stomach dropped. It was a picture of the hammer. The same hammer she had used. It had been wiped down but not well enough. Blood was still trapped in the grooves of the handle, dark and dried. Moore tapped the photo. This is your family's hammer, she said. Found right next to the body. Lenora's breathing hitched. You said it was a break-in, Moore continued, her voice calm, patient, relentless. So why did the killer use something from inside the house? Lenora felt her heartbeat in her throat. She was drowning. She had no answer. Moore leaned in closer. I think you lied, Lenora, she said softly. Lenora's vision blurred. She couldn't breathe. Her mother's blood was still under her nails. They knew. They knew. Her entire body felt like it was collapsing in on itself. Moore's voice cut through the panic. This is the part where you tell me the truth. While Lenora sat in the interrogation room, Jasper Kane was woken by a knock on the door. He was half asleep, his brain still foggy as he stumbled to answer it. But the second he saw the two officers standing on his porch, his stomach dropped. Jasper Kane? One of them asked. Jasper nodded. Yeah. We need to talk to you about Lenora Graves. Jasper's fingers tightened around the doorframe. She's okay, right? His voice wavered. I mean, after what happened to her mom? That's what we need to talk about, the officer interrupted. Lenora was brought in for questioning a few hours ago. Jasper's heart pounded. Why? The officer's next words knocked the breath from his lungs. Because we believe she's the one who killed her mother. Jasper staggered back. His head shook on instinct. No, that's not possible. But the officers just watched him. And in that moment, Jasper realized something. He had never really known what Lenora was capable of. Back in the interrogation room, Lenora's entire body shook. She could still hear her mother's voice. Could still see the way she looked at her before the final blow. She had thought she could get away with it. She had thought she was smarter than them. But now she could see it all crumbling. She wasn't in control anymore. Her story wasn't tight enough. Her act wasn't good enough. And they knew. They had known from the start. Moore's voice was gentle. Lenora, this is your chance. Tell me what really happened. Lenora squeezed her eyes shut. She was trapped. There was no way out. Her lips parted. And then, she confessed. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt peaceful, but the kind that pressed down on your chest, heavy and suffocating. The kind that made your ears ring because you knew something life-changing was about to happen. Lenora sat stiffly at the defense table, hands clasped tightly in her lap. She wore a plain, oversized jumpsuit, the color of loss, of guilt, of endings. Her hair, once neatly styled, hung limply around her face. Her eyes were empty. She had stopped crying weeks ago. The trial had been short. Too much evidence. Too many inconsistencies in her story. And her confession, the moment she finally broke, was all they needed to seal her fate. She had been offered a plea deal. Admit guilt. No trial. No chance at a lesser charge. She had signed the papers with a steady hand, her signature looking almost too neat, too calm for someone admitting to murdering her own mother. Now all that was left was the sentence. Judge Daniel Whitaker sat high on his bench, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the documents in front of him. The gallery behind Lenora was filled with people. Reporters. Strangers. A few distant relatives who had come to witness the end of Rochelle Graves' only daughter. And in the very back, Jasper. Lenora hadn't seen him in weeks. She hadn't spoken to him since that night at the police station, when she had been led away in handcuffs and he had just stood there, his face pale, his lips parted in shock. Now as she turned slightly, her gaze met his. He looked different. Thinner. tired. Like he had aged years in just a few months. But it was his eyes that hurt the most. They held nothing for her now. No anger. No sadness. Just emptiness. A hollow space where love used to be. Lenora forced herself to look away. Judge Whitaker finally cleared his throat. The room tensed. "This is not an easy case," he began, his voice steady, measured. "The court has carefully reviewed the details of this crime. The brutality of the act, the deliberate cover-up attempt, and the lack of any reasonable explanation for the excessive force used." Lenora's fingers tightened against each other. She already knew what was coming. She had played the scene in her mind 100 times. "I have considered the plea agreement submitted by the defense," Whitaker continued. "Given the evidence presented, the severity of the crime, and the premeditated nature of the attack, the court finds that a lesser sentence would not serve justice." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Lenora's chest felt tight. "The defendant, Lenora Elaine Graves, is hereby sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Lenora felt nothing. Not surprise. Not sadness. Just numbness. She barely registered the sound of the judge's gavel hitting the desk, barely noticed the way the bailiff stepped forward, already reaching for her arm. Her eyes drifted back toward the gallery. Jasper was already standing up. Leaving. He didn't wait for the guards to take her away. He didn't look back. He just walked out of the courtroom, disappearing through the doors like he was erasing her from his life. And he was. Lenora didn't move. Didn't cry. Didn't beg. There was nothing left to fight for. Nothing left at all. The transport van rumbled down the highway, the thick metal bars over the windows casting long dark shadows across Lenora's lap. Her wrists were cuffed, her ankles shackled to the floor. No one spoke. The other inmates, women in faded jumpsuits, their faces lined with years of regret, stared out the windows in silence. Lenora did too. She watched as the city blurred past, as the life she would never live again faded behind her. For 17 years she had been trapped under her mother's rules. Now she was trapped under something worse. Something permanent. The prison loomed in the distance, tall and gray, wrapped in coils of razor wire. The place where she would spend the rest of her life. The van turned sharply onto the gravel road leading to the gates. Lenora lifted her chin, watching as the last bit of blue sky disappeared behind the high concrete walls. And for the first time since it all began, she felt afraid. Really truly afraid. Because this time there was no escape. No second chance. No more lies. Just a lifetime behind bars. Just the cold, gray walls of a cage that would never open. Months passed. Seasons changed. Inside everything stayed the same. Lenora woke up to the sound of metal doors clanging, to the bitter scent of bleach and cheap soap. She learned the unspoken rules of prison. When to speak. When to stay quiet. Who to avoid. She did what she was told. She kept her head down. She waited. Because someone would come to see her. Maybe not now. Maybe not soon. But eventually. Her aunt, her cousins, Jasper. Someone. But no one ever did. Lenora sat in the visiting area, staring at the empty chair in front of her. The one she had hoped, foolishly, desperately, that Jasper might sit in one day. But the requests she sent him were never answered. The letters she wrote, folded neatly, filled with words she couldn't say in court, all returned unopened. He had moved on. He had left her here. And now, she was just another forgotten prisoner. Another tragic story. Another girl who had made a terrible mistake. And as she stood up from the empty table, stepping back into the world she would never escape, she realized. This wasn't just her punishment. This was her mother's final lesson. The one she would spend the rest of her life learning.